Hello, I'm here with Dr. Joseph Izzo from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and an expert in the measurement of blood pressure and the interpretation of blood pressure in various different arterial sites. Joe, do we measure blood pressure accurately and properly nowadays?
Well, Henry, the blood pressure in the arm is only one representation of blood pressure in the body. The basic principle is the diastolic pressure is reasonably constant everywhere in the body, at least in the major arteries. But when it comes to studying pulsatile pressure, the systolic pressure is not constant throughout the body. And that's because the systolic pressure is more subject to characteristics of how pulse waves travel in arteries and how those pulse waves are reflected back toward the heart in the same arteries.
Now, we've built an empire, shall we say, on understanding what blood pressure is measured with a cuff on the arm. Are we missing something?
Well, arm cuff blood pressures are extraordinarily important public health tools. And they're rough approximations of blood pressure. I think that's the best way to think about it. So if you have hundreds of thousands of people, a rough approximation ends up being pretty good to show biologic effects. The bigger problem is in the variation in pressure within and between individuals, and how it's measured does have an influence on what you think the blood pressure is at any given point in the arterial tree, or perhaps between you and me. So there really are differences.
There are people who are saying now that the cuff blood pressure, as we've been doing it since the 19th century, doesn't tell us everything we need to know about arterial health. Doesn't tell us about central blood pressure. What is central blood pressure? How do we measure it, and what does it mean?
Right. Again, this idea of pulsatility. The pulse waves modify themselves, and like waves in water, can summate at certain points along the arterial tree or find low points, depending on how colliding waves interact. In the case of the central blood pressure, as a general rule, the pressure is lower at the aorta than it is in the arm. And the reason for that is that the progressive taper in the arterial circulation to the arm causes the pressure to increase as it travels along the arterial tree, because there is a progressive increase in impedance. That's confounded further by waves reflecting back to the heart, and where they happen to summate with these amplified forward traveling waves. So it's a bit of a complex situation. In general, we know that the arm cuff blood pressure gives us useful information from a public health point of view. We assume that that is consistent within patient care, so each patient benefits from a lower blood pressure. But if we want to be really precise about what the pressures are, we've got to go to more sophisticated measures. And indeed, there's a lot more information in a pulse contour than the peak value, the systolic, and the floor value, the diastolic.
Now, people talk about pulse wave velocity and augmentation index. What are those, and what do they mean?
Pulse wave velocity is a very good measure of the stiffness of an artery. The stiffer your artery, the faster the pulse wave travels.
So high is worse?
High is generally worse, absolutely correct. Now, augmentation index refers to the proportion of the pressure, systolic, caused by the addition of the reflected wave to the forward traveling wave. So in fact, waves are traveling down the arterial tree, bouncing back to the heart, and then bouncing back again down the arterial tree. And the timing, which is partly dependent on pulse wave velocity, and the amplitude of each of these wave reflections determines characteristics such as augmentation index.
What does that have to do with heart rate?
Heart rate has a small variation in this. It's there, but indeed most of these measures are corrected for heart rate. Not pulse wave velocity per se, and not always augmentation index, but there are small influences of heart rate itself.
How could a clinician measure these?
There are simple ways to use what's called applanation tonometry, which is a very fancy way of taking a pulse. If my fingers were sensitive enough, I could detect these minor lumps and bumps in the pulse wave, perhaps the way the ancient Chinese clinicians could 5,000 years ago and even wrote about. But I'm not that good, so I need a technical device in order to measure these additional humps in the pulse contour. Usually means that in the arm there's a shoulder peak in addition to the peak systole. So in fact there are two systolic peaks. We call them P1 and P2. The second, P2, is usually lower than P1, and that second, P2, is more closely related to the central pressure.
But you were saying it's the central pressure that matters. We're not measuring it directly in the central pressure. What are we doing to get that
Right.
concept?
So what happens is we use what's called a transfer function to break down the components of the peripheral pulse, and then using an algorithm developed from a variety of studies, we apply that transfer function to yield a derived central pressure when the only measurement is the peripheral pressure.
So you're going to be doing it here and transferring the information to what's going on
Right,
here.
and the techniques have been reasonably well validated to give a central systolic pressure. The newer idea is that we may have a simplified way by simply looking at the shoulder or second peak of the systolic pulse contour at the brachial or radial artery.
I see. Do you think that's ready for prime time?
It's definitely ready for all research studies. Whether it's ready for clinical practice is a debate we've had for many years now.
Tell me about the CAFE study. That seemed to validate the idea.
CAFE is only one of several studies looking at how good central pressures are as predictors of bad outcomes, cardiovascular events. And indeed, what CAFE showed was that a beta blocker-based regimen, when compared to an amlodipine-based regimen, may yield the same pressure decrease in the brachial artery, but the amlodipine-based regimen was much better at lowering central arterial pressure than the beta blocker-based regimen. And the reason for that was the amlodipine diminished the wave reflection component. There was less summation of the reflected and forward traveling waves, and therefore the central systolic pressure was substantially lower, missed by what was measured in the brachial artery, and potentially this difference accounted for the superior outcomes in the amlodipine-based arm.
But they only did that after a year. They didn't do it at baseline. Does
It's
that trouble
true,
you?
but if you looked at the entire comparison of the study, the value was that they did have these measurements yearly throughout the course of the study. They were stable, and at the end of the day, it was the end of the study comparison that really mattered.
I've authored a paper with Bill Elliott that it's not beyond the blood pressure, it's the blood pressure. CAFE doesn't change my mind.
That's correct.
It may be where the blood pressure is measured that really matters.
I think it's a fair statement.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thank you all.